At this time, I would like for you guys to underline Vietnamization, as this becomes a policy under President Nixon's desire to gradually reduce America's role in the Vietnam War. And we also need to remember that Nixon was elected under the notion that he was going to end the war and that there could be some form of honorable peace. And he made efforts or gestures that gave off the impression that he was going to end the war. However, once he became president, he realized how difficult this might actually be. You know, most people, when they're running for office, they'll say, well, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And then you finally get into position and you realize, oh, wait a minute, that's not how I thought this was going to work out. For Nixon, Vietnamization was this notion of gradually withdrawing American troops from South Vietnam and replacing U.S. involvement, leadership, training, and intelligence with that of the South Vietnamese troops. The notion was like, we're taking the training wheels off, and America's presence no longer needs to be here. The Vietnamese can be in charge of protecting themselves after so many years of assistance. And we can see a parallel with America's withdrawal from Afghanistan, and how quickly that turned around. That maybe if, you know, the moment you leave a room, um, or better yet, like let's say you're working at like a restaurant, some fast food restaurant, and the manager walks out of the restaurant. If that restaurant ceases to operate, well then it implies that the workers are not ready to work unsupervised, that they have not been, or they're not in a space to take care of the situation on their own accord, and it leads to chaos. Again, we see this, or we saw this in Afghanistan, and we will see this in Vietnam. But at the very least, this was Nixon's attempt to try and get America out of Vietnam in an honorable fashion. However, to many Americans, they are going to look at Vietnamization as prolonging America's presence, that it was a half-hearted effort, attempt, that if anything, this was a lie. Because not Lincoln, Nixon sold or gave off the impression that we were getting out of this war under his administration. So once the notion of Vietnamization was in full effect, there would be protests all throughout the United States at various college campuses, um, most infamously at Kent State in Ohio. This was a public university with a large working class student body. There were protests there, and apparently a firebomb had been thrown at the JROTC. Um, and this is a group of junior military cats on a college campus. Um, and after that, then the National Guard will be called to secure um, peace, I guess, on the campus. So they come in with weapons. The young protesters are agitated. They're upset about the situation, and this is their way of expressing that. And when it was all said and done, um, the soldiers are going to fire at the protesters as they're getting um, angrier and louder and more violent. And we end up with 4 people killed on a college campus uh, for protesting by U.S. soldiers. That's where this is going. Um, Now, in regards to how this will be perceived in the media, I mean, there are numerous polls being taken regarding the situation at Kent State. Only 11% of Americans, when polled, were siding with the students, whereas close to 60% of Americans were siding with the guardsmen uh, in this particular situation, which is interesting because there was definitely an anti soldier sentiment because of the Vietnam War. However, in this particular case, when you have American soldiers against American protesters, the protesters end up looking like the bad guys in the media, and sometimes it turns out that way. But nonetheless, these type of protests are evidence of the disgruntled nature that is developing regarding the Vietnam War, um, and the notion of Vietnamization. Um, Again, was Nixon's attempt to de-escalate our involvement in the Vietnam War. However, it gave off the impression that we were prolonging. Yes, it may be de-escalating, but it would prolong America's involvement in Vietnam at large. At this time, I would like for you guys to underline the My Lai massacre. It's right here. This takes place in 1968. The event itself, a company of American troops are going to kill, um, it says here, some 350 South Vietnamese civilians, men, women, and children. Their estimates up to 400 to 500. The notion was that there was a village that was known to have booby traps, um, individuals that were um, considered threats to soldiers in the area, and they were informed that they needed to go and search and destroy. Um, and that's exactly what they did, and they ended up killing everyone. Um, the Vietnam War is a difficult war in that, in most conventional conflicts, there's an attire that's worn. This guy is wearing this uniform, that person's wearing that uniform. I know that this is an enemy combatant. When you begin to delve into guerrilla warfare, um, the enemy combatant can look like any normal person off the street. You don't know until it's too late. Many American soldiers are operating in this headspace, and the violence that is going to be perpetuated it's disgusting. It's reported um, to various levels of the U.S. government and military with little to no response. Um, in an interview, it will be revealed that this event took place. Investigation will occur. 14 um, servicemen will be charged with the crime. However, only one will be found guilty. That individual will be sentenced to life and paroled in under 3 years. As the American people are exposed to these type of acts, it further cements their suspicion, their concerns, their disgust with war at large, um, and it creates even greater distrust in their so-called leaders, um, in the institutions of America. The My Lai massacre is a gross representation of the U.S. military um, in conflict, and it is a black eye on U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. It's a black eye in U.S. history. Um, and war is not easy. There are rules. to conflict, and America tends to hold themselves to a higher standard when considering rules for engagement. In this particular case, um, we didn't live up to those standards. To have this many people killed, many of them civilians, uh, is disheartening to say the least. At this time, I'd like for you guys to underline the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers represent a collection of documents that were photocopied by an individual by the name of Daniel Ellsberg. That's this guy right here. I'm not gonna, maybe I'll just, there, that's Daniel Ellsberg. And he prepares, he gains access to these documents. Many of them are memos, letters. All of them are, you know, classified, top secret, not to be shared. Information regarding America's involvement in Vietnam from the very beginning, and through the letters, through the memos, through the communique, it's clear that America is not in a position to win this war. There was never any evidence to suggest we were going to win this war. If anything, it counteracted all of the narrative that was being pushed by the Secretary of Defense at the time, the presidents, the various presidents of the United States during the entire period of the war, that the American people were right in their suspicions that this was, or that they were being lied to about this entire conflict. That's exactly what the Pentagon Papers were about. And so this guy has access to these documents, and he leaks them to the newspaper. The newspaper publishes them. A document here, a document there, and even in publishing the documents, there were questions of whether or not if this was ethical, the dangers that would result in the fallout. And it really exposed the U.S. government, U.S. military action to the American people. I mean, it's like discovering, my goodness, if somebody had the receipts, somebody had the chat log. I mean, my goodness, and this too, the Pentagon Papers, when exposing this intelligence, of course, and then the powers that be will argue, well, this is dangerous. And let me say something, that when the government says that something is dangerous, it's usually just a danger to them. It's a danger to their position. It's a danger to their perspective and their narrative, that they might get exposed. And that's exactly what happened with the Pentagon Papers. And we can make an argument that that's the argument that happened with WikiLeaks post 9/11. It's what happened with Snowden, Edward Snowden, that is, informing the American people that their government was spying on them, under the guise that they were only spying on terrorists after 9/11 under the Patriot Act. In reality, they were spying on all of us. And he risked his life. Daniel Ellsberg will have to risk his life. He will be charged with all types of crimes against the government. And ultimately, those charges will be dismissed, and he won't have to live in the conditions that Edward Snowden is currently living, just so that we could be aware of how grimy the game can be at times. He didn't have to do any of that. Edward Snowden, Daniel Ellsberg, either or. They didn't have to do any of this. They did this because they thought that this is what should be done, that this is what the American people should be aware of. And as a result of that, there's going to be an even greater a deeper wedge between the American people and the American government. There's an even deeper divide and distrust that we see in elements of our society to this very day, whether it's the deep state or the Illuminati. It's pick your poison, if you will. Nonetheless, however, from the Pentagon Papers, that everything that I just mentioned is why they are significant because of the exposure and the distrust that will emanate, and the desire to keep our government officials accountable for their actions. And so in 1973, the War Powers Act will be passed, which will require the president to seek congressional approval for the commitment of American troops overseas. Now, again, the thing about certain acts and laws is that if you can afford proper representation, an attorney, they will find ways uh, to do what they ultimately want to do. Also in 1973, the Paris Peace Accords will be signed, and these will ultimately establish a ceasefire agreement. In that, it left in place both governments. So there's going to be a North Vietnam, there's going to be a South Vietnam, but it will require the final withdrawal of U.S. troops. If you can take a look at that picture right there, you see people scrambling to get out of South Vietnam because they know what this means. And, if you uh, have been aware of America's withdrawal from Afghanistan um, within the past year or two, and how chaotic that was. Uh, the Paris Peace Accords ultimately ending America's presence in the Vietnam War will have a similar effect because within 2 years' time, the North Vietnamese are going to launch a final military invasion and reunify Vietnam under communist rule. And when America withdrew from Afghanistan, the Taliban reestablished themselves. And then you have to ask yourself, in what is considered one of America's longest wars, the amount of men and women that have served, fought, died, suffered, the amount of money that has been spent for them to be back in power. Like, is that how that was supposed to work out? Uh, Nonetheless, there are some parallels that we can draw upon. But this will be the Paris Peace Accords will be the conclusion of America's involvement in the Vietnam War, um, setting the stage for many people to determine as to whether or not were we successful. Did we win? For me, growing up, it was a war that we really didn't talk about much. And maybe it was because, well, we never got to it. And we had to cover other things. Difficult subjects um, or losses in general are not easy to talk about. I think across the board, it's easy to say that the Vietnam War was not a victory. And if it's not that, then, what is it? When the United States fought in Vietnam, it was organized modern technology versus organized human beings, and the human beings won. Conventional warfare, having all the weapons, having all the ammunition, having all the resources, having all the intelligence, um, doesn't hold up at times when the opposing side has all the heart. Americans weren't really sure what they were fighting for. Things had changed. What is containment? Why? These people are are living the best they can considering the circumstances, and we're over here trying to bomb them into oblivion so that they can not accept communism? For who? No Vietnamese person has ever discriminated against any American or were a threat to the American people on our soil. What are we doing? The non-monetary price of the war was devastating. It broke the psyche of America. Americans lost confidence in their government. They were making and held the U.S. military servicemen in total disregard and disgust, oftentimes referring to them as baby killers, spat upon when they returned home. America's in a bad place. Everything that we thought or were raised to believe, uh, we, um, we just don't know anymore. And this was a long time coming, but we're not even done. At this time, I want you guys to underline Watergate. Now, anytime you hear anybody use the word gate, it usually implies that there's some type of scandal taking place. So it's Pizzagate, Watergate, Inflategate, Trumpgate, Elon Gate. I don't care what it is. Anything with the gate on it makes you think that, oh, well, this involves a scandal. And yes, this is the epitome of political scandal during this turbulent time in American history. It says here that Nixon was obsessed with secrecy and believed criticism to be a threat against national security. He had an enemies list. Sounds very Stalin-like. And ultimately, he was always insecure and paranoid at the idea that the American people never really liked him. He often thought that most people didn't like him. And he wanted to be liked. And he wanted to secure that he was going to win at any cost. Um, so agents within his administration are going to break into the Democratic National Convention headquarters in the Watergate apartment complex or hotel in Washington, D.C. 5 former employees of Nixon's reelection committee took part in this break in, and they were under authorization in order to find any type of information that could incriminate the Democratic Party, making it easier for them to use that evidence as leverage and win the election. This is political espionage. And this has always happened. It has always, if you don't think political parties have not been engaged in this type of action in order to secure an election, they have. It's just that Nixon got caught. He got caught. And he got caught in one of the worst times to get caught. America was reaping a whirlwind. You know, everything was stacking on to each other, and it was just timing. And Watergate was exactly that. Nixon is going to deny knowing anything about the break-in, deny knowing the individuals, deny this and deny that accordingly. So, and before you know it, oh man, I mean, you had members of his administration resigning here, resigning there, some refusing to resign. Nixon was like, yo, jump ship now. That way we can protect you. Go ahead and resign. I'll pardon you later. I mean, it's just a whole bunch of crazy stuff. And an investigation is happening. They're trying to get Nixon impeached. And he knows it's coming down. And it's right around the corner. It's right around the corner. Um, Nixon is also secretly recording conversations in the White House often referred to as the Nixon tapes. He argues that the tapes or the desire to record is so that he could prove and exonerate himself. However, when it was made privy that these tapes existed, uh, investigators subpoenaed and required that these tapes be submitted into evidence, and he refused to um, give them up because he wasn't really sure what was on the tapes. You know, um, imagine if every aspect of your life is being recorded in places that you're unaware that you're being recorded, exposing this, exposing that, exposing you, exposing them. Watergate was so scandalous, and Nixon was so aware of the turmoil and chaos it was causing all around them. He knew what he had to do. Further investigation led to the unveiling of other burglaries, wiretaps, and political sabotage. Um, as I've already mentioned, Nixon even recorded conversations in his office. The Supreme Court demanded the Nixon tapes, and Nixon will ultimately resign from office. The Watergate scandal shocked America, again, exposing um, Americans to the realities of America's political life, America's political way. Richard Nixon will be the first president to resign from office. He was never impeached. He escaped that process and hoped that in resigning that he was doing so with the best interest of the United States at heart, that we didn't go through this unnecessary impeachment process, which I think he knew he probably wasn't going to escape, that this was probably his only way out. The Church Committee will be Senate hearings that laid out the history of abusive actions by every administration in the Cold War. The FBI had spied on millions of Americans and tried to disrupt the civil rights movement. There's evidence of that, even in the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The COINTELPRO um, agency under J. Edgar Hoover to disrupt and dismantle civil rights organizations such as the Black Panther Party, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and the Nation of Islam. The Church Committee also discovered that the CIA overthrew governments and tried to assassinate various leaders around the world. America is being exposed to this. That U.S. history is not all about, Honest Abe and George Washington and a cherry tree and um, that not all that glitters is gold, and not everything in our history is hearts, horseshoes, magical balloons. The Church Committee, go ahead and underline it, is a series of hearings that ultimately exposed Americans to the messed up underbelly of American political life, history, action, existence, seriously undermining America's confidence in their own government. It will lead to the Freedom of Information Act, which will give citizens access to millions of pages of records of federal agencies. Now, granted, many of these documents will be redacted, and granted, they can withhold these documents for periods of time, 25 years. Well, and then we'll release it in 25 years. Okay, and then after those 25 years, well, we got to release it in another 25 years because the people we thought were going to die, they're not dead. And so, It's all a mess, man. It's all a mess. However, as negative as all of that may sound, um, I still got to have hope. And it reminds me of this quote from Howard Zinn, an American historian. To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, and kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. If we only see the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places, and there are so many where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act. And at least the possibility of sending this spinning top of a world in different directions. And if we do act, in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. That the future is an infinite succession of presents. And to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, in itself is a marvelous victory.